The official Alberta election results will be released on Thursday. Now, they'll confirm that both the UCP's Tyler Shandro and Whitney Issik lost their seats. Now, Shandro lost by just 7 votes. What's most interesting right now is how Premier Daniel Smith's cabinet will shape up moving forward. To chat about this in more detail is our political reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us from Edmonton. Tyler, could we see somebody like maybe Nathan Neudorf, who was Infrastructure Minister and Deputy Premier, get an even juicier portfolio?
It seems likely. Part of what Danielle Smith's challenge is going to be is she's lost a lot of her sort of longer term cabinet ministers and people with more experience. You had Sonia Savage and Travis Taves, the energy minister and finance minister, respectively, who decided not to run again. You had, I think, 6 or 7 ministers total who lost their elections, including Tyler Shandro, including Casey Madu. Who did she pick? And the other thing is that there's 49 UCP MLAs, and Danielle Smith's last cabinet had 25 members. So is half of her caucus going to also be in cabinet? That seems sort of strange. So she's going to have a little bit of an experience problem, frankly. It doesn't mean that, less experienced or newer MLAs can't turn into great ministers. Travis Taves, I believe, was only a one-term member of the government. But it is a little bit of a challenge. Usually there's sort of this stack of people who've been around for a long time for a premier or a prime minister to choose from, and she does not have that at the moment. We should know, I think by Friday seems to be sort of the chatter going around that's when cabinet will be released. So there'll be, I think, a few interesting people and maybe a few surprises in there.
Yeah, maybe some rookies getting some interesting portfolios as cabinet ministers. Now, Tyler, the NDP picked up seats. The UCP lost around 14 seats this election, but still formed a slim majority. Now, you say some of the votes the Conservatives lost didn't necessarily go to the NDP. Can you explain?
Well, it's really hard to know, right? That it's not like there's great data on where votes moved throughout the election. But if you sort of look at some of the numbers, you can make a few guesses. The NDP, for example, picked up give or take 150,000 votes from 2019, and the Alberta Party lost, give or take, 150,000 votes. So maybe you can look at that and say, okay, well, the NDP's performance in 2023 came largely from Alberta Party voters. You could maybe conclude that, but really hard to say for certain. And now you have the UCP, which had over 1 million votes in 2019, and they lost about 100,000, I think, somewhere in that range. But did they all go to the NDP? Well, if you look at the Alberta Party numbers and conclude that they went to the NDP, maybe these UCP numbers didn't. So it's all kind of speculative. But at the end of the day, what this could mean is that you had a good number of United Conservative voters who stayed home on the election, who maybe weren't certain about Danielle Smith, maybe lean conservative, but aren't totally conservative, but don't like the NDP either, and they just decided to go for a pizza or go for a haircut or who knows. So it's not like we have really clear information on what happened here, but some of the chatter, some of the discussion that's happening among columnists, among pundits, among political analysts seems to be that maybe there actually was a bit of a turnout issue for the UCP, and that maybe explains some of the things that went wrong in some of those ridings that they lost.
There was also a recent report that came out which said that some voters in the rural ridings were actually turned away at the polls.
Oh, really?
In Nobleford, just outside of Lethbridge here.
Oh, interesting. I hadn't heard anything about that. There's usually on election day, there's sort of the odd controversy over people who don't know what ID they need to bring or whether they need to have an attestation, things like that. And of course, there was the discussion on election night about why everything was so slow and whether or not there was an issue with tabulators. So it seems like it all largely worked out, but there's a few hours there on election night in particular when people are kind of scratching their heads wondering what was going on.
Yeah, we're still trying to recover more than a week later after election night, working the 14, 16 hours. Tyler, the UCP were shut out of Edmonton, although they did pick up some seats around the area, around the provincial capital. Premier Smith has proposed a council of defeated candidates to advise her on the issues in Edmonton. So how do you think this is going to go over with Edmonton City Council and the NDP?
Well, a little bit like a lead balloon. The city council, well, the mayor, Amarjeet Sohi, came out and said, look, we've got representatives on city council. By all means, give us a call. We'd be happy to talk. And the NDP said in sort of this tongue-in-cheek brief press release saying that we've got a council of the elected that you're certainly welcome to consult on Edmonton issues. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, this government, it's been a bit of a joke over the past 4 years that this government, it loves its consultations, it loves its studies, it loves its panels. I mean, I could name probably almost a half dozen of them off the top of my head. So it's not out of character, I don't think. And, a couple of the political types I've been talking to who aren't even necessarily affiliated with the UCP say, if I was in their position, I would do the same thing. Why not? But certainly the people who did win election are saying, well, gosh, why not ask us? But of course, they're not going to get some of the information they want if there's those sorts of consultations happening. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with it. This was sort of a proposal more than a here's the plan of what exactly we're going to do. So details on that may be yet to come, but it would not surprise me if we saw some of those familiar yet defeated faces pop up.
Tyler, now that the dust has settled somewhat on the Alberta election, what will the relationship look like moving forward between Danielle Smith's UCP and the Trudeau government?
That is a great question, and I think a little bit of an open question. On her election night speech, Danielle Smith took quite a strong tone towards Ottawa, saying, I hope cabinet minister, or I hope Trudeau's caucus and cabinet are watching right now, basically saying that they're going to fight the Trudeau government every step of the way on various proposals, the net zero of the electricity grid being one of them, an emissions cap on the oil and gas sector being another. But a couple days later, the various Liberals on Parliament Hill who are in cabinet took a little bit more of a conciliatory tone, I think it would be fair to say. You Dominic LeBlanc, who's the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister, saying he anticipates a good working relationship. He's going into it with an open mind, those sorts of things. So, I mean, of course, no politician in Ottawa is going to come out and say, no, we're gonna give as good as we get kind of thing. We're going to fight back too. That's just, not really the way the federal government is about to do things in public. But part of this is going back in history a bit, but part of the reason why the UCP dumped Jason Kenney was because they thought he was too soft on Ottawa. Now, that was not a big issue during the election campaign, I wouldn't say, the whole Ottawa-Alberta relationship. But it is something that the party's base, party members care very, very deeply about. So it is going to be interesting to see how Danielle Smith, who seems to have moved a little bit to the middle, sort of navigates that challenge a little bit between doing what her party members and her caucus might want versus what sort of the rest of the province wants. Plus, are the Trudeau folks going to play ball? Are they going to play nice? Are they going to play mean? I mean, it's a little up in the air, but certainly the tone set right off the bat is a pretty aggressive one, I would say.
Premier Smith said one of her first orders of business once she was reelected was to bring forth legislation that requires a referendum on tax increases. But Tyler, what else do we know about the UCP's agenda moving forward? Will Calgary finally get its new arena?
That seems to still be sort of under discussion. I think it's a definite possibility. There was some talk this week at City Council, I believe, about what that proposal was going to look like. I expect that'll be the sort of thing we hear quite a bit about over the summer. One of the things about the UCP's legislative agenda is it doesn't seem like they're going to be sitting this summer. They're most likely to come back in October. Presumably because they need to get a bunch of their ducks in a row and decide how they're going to roll out that legislative agenda. But we don't expect to see a whole lot of movement legislatively in the next few months here, which is going to make things rather quiet. But also, it'll give them time to hash stuff out. How do you write a bill for a referendum on tax increases? What's that going to include? All that kind of stuff. So it'll be a bit of a waiting game, frankly.
Danielle Smith made a lot of promises during her campaign. In fact, there didn't appear to be much difference between what she was promising and Rachel Notley and the NDP promised voters. Will Danielle Smith maybe stay the moderate course? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's hard to say. She exhibited what I think is fair to say an unusual amount of message discipline during the campaign. She got herself in hot water a few times prior to the campaign. Obviously, she had a long political career and a long journalism career where there was lots of stuff that she'd said that caused controversy, but she really, really stuck to her moderate talking points, especially on healthcare would be probably the big one where she was really disciplined in saying that there's not going to be any privatization of healthcare. So What happens if she stays the moderate course? Well, possibly she angers some of her supporters within the party. But if she moves a little bit further to the right, is she going to anger some of the more moderate Albertans that maybe voted for her? So I expect that her path to victory in the future is a more moderate one, given especially how important Calgary and Edmonton are, and obviously those cities are becoming more progressive compared to the rest of the province. But you never know. I think that's probably the logical path for her to follow. But the pressure from the party, the pressure from caucus, as we saw with Jason Kenney, it can make it quite hard to sort of try and chart a moderate course.
So maybe more of a centrist course, I guess, so to speak,
Yeah, I
right?
mean, I think so. I mean, I think that probably, she'll be more right wing on things like the relationship with Ottawa. But do I think that she's going to continue to sort of relitigate some of the COVID-19 stuff? Is she going to tackle some of the promises about adding vaccination status to the Human Rights Code? I think those things are a little bit less likely.
Tyler, Rachel Notley has now lost 2 elections to the UCP. Will she be sticking around as leader, or could we see somebody like Lethbridge West MLA Shannon Phillips or maybe even David Shepherd step into the role?
Yeah, she said she's staying. For what that's worth, politicians do sort of tend to say that, and then they're out the door 6 months later. So, I mean, the honest answer is I don't know. I mean, I think this is something that a lot of politics watchers have been wondering and have been talking about. And for the NDP, I think whatever happens, they need to decide whether or not this is the Rachel Notley NDP or the Alberta New Democrats, if you know what I mean. How entwined with the party's identity and the fate of the party is Rachel Notley. The federal NDP went through a similar thing with Jack Layton when he died. And frankly, I think the federal Conservatives went through the same thing when Stephen Harper left. It took, I think, probably both Aaron O'Toole and Andrew Scheer coming to Pierre Poilievre to sort of figure out what the party's identity was. So the NDP is in a bit of an interesting spot because in some ways Rachel Notley is their strongest asset, but obviously she's not going to be around forever, whatever happens. So I suspect it's a thing that politics watchers are talking about. I imagine it's the sort of thing that people within the party are considering as well.
Tyler, when I worked on Parliament Hill as a national parliamentary reporter, I remember the orange wave that made its way into our nation's capital. Jack Layton was so popular at that point in time, and many people thought that if he wouldn't have passed on, that he may have become prime minister. He was that popular at that time.
He was. It's amazing in some ways how important a leader is to a party's success. And Rachel Notley, I think, is in a very similar position, and the NDP is as well. So, whether or not they're thinking about it, I mean, honestly, they probably should, because as we've seen with the federal NDP, losing a really popular leader can put you out in the wilderness for quite some time.
The provincial state of emergency has ended for our province, and some fire bans have actually been dropped. They've been lifted in a few regions. But so far this wildfire season, it's been record-breaking. A lot of wildfires, Tyler.
And it's very early. That's the alarming thing about it. I wrote a story maybe last year about the way fires start. And at the beginning of the season, you often have human-caused fires. And as you come later in the season, you end up with lightning strikes and things like that. So there's a lot, obviously, that's within our control, being smart about off-highway vehicle use, being smart about disposing of cigarettes and putting out campfires. But there is also Mother Nature, conspiring against us. So, I really do think that whether the legislature comes back or not, that's probably going to be something that Danielle Smith and her party are going to have to keep an eye on in the next few months, because who knows what happens next,
He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post. Tyler Dawson, thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks so much, Hal.